So we're going to focus on three little words that have a big impact: coding, coverage, and payment. I've been in medical devices since 1992, when I started. My first assignment was to write an advanced bionics business plan. They did everything I told them to do, and they sold it twice for over $3 billion. So that was the start of my career. Through many of my companies that I've worked with, Bioness, Advanced Bionics, Boston Scientific, many others, where reimbursement, certainly going back many years, was more of an afterthought. Now it's really a forethought where it's absolutely critical to the business. I was a consultant for 7 years. I've worked with 14 neuromodulation companies throughout my career, and recently just went back into industry with Mainstay Medical. Very excited to be part of that team there. And I really don't want to say too much more about that, and I'm actually going to skip my slides for the most part. Maybe I'll go to the last one. But I want to introduce our two panelists, and I also want to engage a lot of folks that are here in the audience today, because reimbursement is so important. I'd like to hear from different perspectives as well. Tony Arnold from SetPoint, he's gone through reimbursement. I'd like to hear some of his comments. Dan, where are you? You're very early stage. Have you even thought about it? Or Manfred as well. And then, do we have any of the VCs still here? Or even Mark? Okay, we do. Great. So when you're investing in a company, depending on where they are, how big a consideration is reimbursement to that equation in terms of you investing? So I'd love to hear just a few quick comments. But let's start over here. So let me introduce both Tom and Courtney. Courtney, I've worked with her, had the privilege while she was a VP over at Exonics. I worked there for a little bit with her. She was a VP over at Kernel. She was a director of reimbursement over at Boston Scientific. Her whole focus has been reimbursement. And she is now a principal at Anacapa. And I want to have you say a little bit about what you're doing today. Okay, let's go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So just a quick correction. My focus is generally clinical research. But with every time you do clinical research these days, as you mentioned, you're always thinking about reimbursement because you don't want to have to do the same study twice. So it's not incorrect to say that I've been thinking about reimbursement for over a decade, but in the context of clinical trials primarily.
Yes. Thank you. And we really want to hear today about how do you design reimbursement considerations when you're designing your studies, because a lot of companies, in my experience, really get caught because they haven't had that. And then they are delayed by many years trying to now get CMS and private payer reimbursement. So, and then let me just introduce Tom. So Tom is our RCRI. Probably most people here have heard of them. They're certainly one of the largest, if not the largest CRO. Before that, he was an independent consultant for 7 years and held various VP and director roles in the industry on reimbursement. And I think you started your career as a healthcare attorney.
Correct.
Many years ago.
Don't ask me how I got from there to here.
All right, yeah, that's so. Actually, Courtney, why don't you let's start with you in terms of just telling us a little bit about what you do today and how perhaps you can help the numerous startups that we have here.
Sure. So my background, I have an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering. I have a PhD in health science and technology from a joint program between Harvard Medical School and MIT. And ever since I graduated, I've then been working on medical device development. Most recently, I've got my own company called Anacapa Clinical Research. And the purpose of Anacapa is to help small companies do clinical research right. So I've been working in this space for over a decade now, and what I've seen is that medical device companies, they make really cool tech, and then they can often fall on their face when they do a clinical trial. So I've been trying to help them not do that anymore. So that's my mission in life at the moment. I think one of the places where, especially small companies mess this up is they think about how to do a clinical study to get approval, but then they don't go on to think about who their real customers are in the future. You've got patients, you've got doctors, hospitals, and payers, and they're all your customers, and they all need to know that what you're designing and what you've built is going to work for them. And the key to that is the data. So there's all these different customers require different kinds of data, and so that's the kind of thing that I like to work with folks on, is really thinking about upfront, what kind of data do we want to collect to make sure that you're answering all these customer needs.
Great. And perhaps can you share a little, maybe one anecdotal story with Axonics, which was certainly a very successful up to where we are today. You saw them earlier. There was a slide where they're about to go pursue an IPO, raising 85 million. So huge success up until to this point. Courtney, just in terms of their reimbursement considerations early on, can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, so for those of you that don't know Axonics, it's a sacral neuromodulation company. It's a very small device, 5.5 cc's, and they are obviously going against Medtronic's InterStim device. One of the things that's been interesting is there's another company, Nuvectra, who is also trying to get into the sacral neuromodulation device at the same time, and the two companies have taken very different paths. So Axonics went forward very quickly with a European clinical trial, which I helped them run, and then the US pivotal study, which they then enrolled very, very quickly, I think 100 and something patients in 6 months. And at the end of that, now they're looking to do an IPO. Nuvectra, on the other hand, is taking a different path, and they're trying to get FDA approval without any clinical data. And I think this goes to my earlier point. At the end of the day, they both get approval, but which company do you want to be? Do you want to be the one who's in the clinic with a bunch of data, or the one who's trying to get in the clinic? So I've really admired Axonics' approach. It's been not the easiest path to raise all the money that they've raised to do all these studies. But at the end of the day, they've got some really nice data that I think is going to really help them win the marketplace at the end.
Great. Anything else you want to say as an introduction, Courtney, before we shift gears to Tom?
I think that's all. Thanks.
Great. Tom, I know you have a
Great.
presentation.
Okay, yeah, and I promised Jim I'd be really brief on my presentation. I'll get into that in a minute why, but no, I just have to agree with Courtney, and what Courtney said is she talks a lot about health economic data as part of clinical study design, and what I'm going to spend most of my time talking about is reimbursement 101 talk to a number of companies out here, and just to make sure everybody's on the same page regarding foundation understanding of what we're talking about when we say reimbursement. So I'll leave it at that and save more of my discussion for the
Great. Actually, let's do the presentation.
All right.
While he's getting set up, I just want to make a comment where one of the companies, for instance, and we don't have to limit the discussion just to the U.S., where...
Can you use this mic?
Oh. But I was doing financial forecasting for a company and forecasting the European and getting input from from the CEO down for European post CE marking, and they had a very aggressive plan. Well, we got our CE mark, and essentially they didn't make a single dollar for the life of the product over in Europe. So a lot of I think companies think that the CE marking is it's the right to sell the product, doesn't mean anyone's going to pay for it. So, country by country, you have to look at the reimbursement and design a strategy and figure out the timetable there. But that was certainly a big lesson. So just wanted to share that anecdote. Tom, please.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I'm Tom Hughes. I'm with RCRI. I'll get into what we do in a minute, just ever so briefly. But I was thinking of this slide when I wrote up the title, and I thought another name for it for this conference could be your device design looks great. Now how are you going to get it paid, right? So, in fact, I just wrote an article for Medical Manufacturing and Outsourcing Handbook this year that should be coming out, and that's kind of the theme. So my brief slide presentation will kind of go over just the really high-level things to think about for a lot of companies who maybe haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it, because I'll tell you right now, when I sit here, and this is my 4th trip here over the years. Just listening to all you scientists. I'm not a scientist, as you heard, I'm an attorney, but I'm just amazed by the technology and the effort that has to go into getting just the design and development done. So with that said, we'll just keep moving on here. Jim, I give you permission to keep me down to less than 10 minutes because I've done this before and I had to whittle 45 slides down to about 10 or 12. And I think I can do it, but there's not even a clock here that I can watch, is there? So you're gonna have to give me the thumbs down or the cut across the neck. Okay. This is RCRI, for those of you who don't know about us. We're based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We're a clinical research organization. You can see what we're doing. We've been around for over 20 years. Started out regulatory, but the RCRI stands for Regulatory and Clinical Research. We have clinical science, we have quality people, and I oversee the health economic and reimbursement. About 60 employees, a lot of different therapeutic areas. A major therapeutic area, of course, is Neurotech, because you can imagine being based in Minnesota, a lot of our people are coming out of the companies you mentioned earlier, Jim, Medtronic, St. Jude, which is now Abbott, 3M, Boston Scientific, and a lot of smaller ones. So that's the tee up to who we are. And like Jeremy also said, he did a great introduction. I was in the medtech industry. I've been an independent consultant and was recruited to RCRI a few years ago. One slide I want you to remember. Everything I say, it's this slide right here. Reimbursement is a three-legged stool. I do meetings with introductory phone calls with startup companies about 2 to 3 times a week, and I ask them 2 major things, well, 3 questions. What's your technology? What's your site of care? And what do you know about reimbursement? And they said, oh, we have a code. I said, okay, that's one leg of the stool, but it's kind of hard to stand on a 3-legged stool with the coding leg, right? You don't have reimbursement unless you have all 3 legs. So I'm going to tell you briefly what those areas are about and why it's important. When you think of reimbursement, don't just think of code and the payment, because you don't have much at all. I was talking to Frank this morning after his presentation. When I was listening to your presentation, Frank, maybe you could just tell folks what you told me about, you've been around for roughly 20 years, and when you started thinking about reimbursement as a whole from this perspective.
We actually, more than thinking of it, we actually started working
Right.
in 2002. And essentially, that was 2 years before, sorry. We started working on reimbursement in 2002, and that was 2 years before our first implant. And the idea was to understand what was going to be required and effectively to develop a process by which we could, our product was going to be, we knew it was going to be classified as one for which we could seek reimbursement for the non-trial related expenses. So we went after that. And that became an excellent method by which we learned, developed relationships, understood what it was that payers were looking for, publications, things of this nature, and then put the whole program in place such that by the time we did get approved, which took way longer than what we wanted, we at least were in good shape from a reimbursement perspective.
That's great, and I just wanted to call him out because it's nothing better than a real-world example of me sitting up here talking, but somebody who did it early, and that's part of what I want to talk about. Okay, so what do I mean when I say reimbursement? Coverage. It's a decision by a payer to pay or not to pay. And the major payers are, who knows? Number one, CMS, private payers, United Healthcare of the world, Aetna, Cigna, what else? All the blues, those are the big ones. Pay attention to those payers and what their coverage policy says. But other people here talked about DARPA. Don't forget, you don't have to hit a home run to get reimbursement. Think of your technology, what area it fits into. It could be military, it could be VA. All you have to do is get a head start with your technology, and then you start to go and you start to get utilization. So don't think you have to take over the payer world. Think of where your sector is. I deal with a number of companies that do work comp. I'm not sure it would work for you folks, but all I'm saying is you have to figure that stuff out. That's coverage. Coverage means medical necessity. It means show me that it's medically necessary. I'll talk about that in a sec. And it varies by payers. CMS, I had talked to somebody at lunch today. They said, well, everybody follows CMS, right? Is that right or wrong? It's wrong. Some will, a lot of them will, but the private payers can do whatever they want. We're still in a capitalistic market. You can decide to contract whatever you want to contract with providers of the world. Coding. This is very complex. I don't have enough time to get into it. I want to say a few things about coding, though. It varies by the site of care. Who knows DRGs? Diagnostic-related groups of 2 types of ICD codes, procedure codes and diagnosis codes. They combine those codes together, and they combine them in a diagnostic-related group of codes, and that's how you're paid in where? What setting?
Inpatient.
Inpatient setting. That's important. There are about 1,000 diagnostic-related groups. Let me give you an example. Percutaneous coronary interventions with drug-eluting stents. I just did an assessment on a company for that. $13,000. That's Medicare diagnostic-related group. And this is why it's important to you folks who go into the inpatient setting. That's all you're going to get if you have that drug-eluting percutaneous technology used in an inpatient setting. So what do hospitals care about? And it kind of goes to what Courtney was talking about. They want to know, and their value access committees that have CFOs and other financial people in those committee meetings are asking these questions. Why should a diagnostic-related group is a bucket of money? If you put something in, you better take something out or it's going to overflow and they're not going to adopt your technology. So what are you going to take out of that bucket? It's probably your competitor, so you better have evidence, as Courtney says, to show that yours is better than the existing alternative. That's DRGs. We got outpatient setting. It's a totally different coding setting. It's CPT codes you may have heard of that are bundled into an ambulatory payment classification, and you got different subsets. Ambulatory surgery center will pay less than an outpatient. Hospital, forget, you go home. You have other coding situations there. We're talking a lot about home products. Those are HCPCS codes. They pay a different coding methodology under Medicare and private payers. You have to understand what that is. The next group is payment. Payment isn't what the hospital or the provider charges to a payer. It's what the payer will pay. And those payment methodologies can get very complicated, and they vary by sites of care. So I'm not going to get into that so much, but just understand, with Medicare, like that DRG, they'll pay, that I gave you the example of, they'll pay you $12,000 or $13,000. You can expect private payer contracts with the hospital system. Acme Hospital will pay maybe 20% more. HCPCS codes for home, they're probably going to pay you 20% less for those HCPCS codes. So those are things you have to be aware of when you start working on commercializing your technology and that sort of thing. Okay, moving right along. I want to get to this because this is what Jeremy and Courtney were getting at. This is what the world looked like 10 years ago, right? Everybody's thinking regulatory, clinical, marketing, as early in the process, product development phase as possible. This is the brave new world we're living in. I talked to all three investment people. They said, you got to have it in your business model. I meet a lot of CEOs and others, stakeholders that Courtney was talking about. You better have some answers as to how you're going to get paid for this product if you want third party to pay for it under a traditional fee-for-service system, or else you're going to have some problems down the road. Think about it early. Don't think about it later. I have a wonderful, but I had a few more slide opportunities. One is my beautiful Field of Dreams, a photo of those baseball players coming out of that field in that movie, and it says, if you build it, they will come. And my answer to that is, they may not come unless you find a way to pay for it, right? They're not going to come unless you find a way to pay for it. It's going to sit there, and I like to use this analogy. You get through the FDA, guess what that gets you? It gets you the permission to sit on the sidelines in the United States. If you want to win the baseball game or the lacrosse game or the football game, you got to get in the game, and you better have a payer strategy. You better have a reimbursement strategy. If you want third parties to pay for it, or if you want a hospital system to pay for it, otherwise you're going to be sitting on the sidelines. And I tell you what, I talked to so many companies, and I talked about this wound care company. They had a great technology. They lost their code. They're sitting in a closet somewhere collecting dust, the technology. Okay, so what do you have to do to get it done? Okay, I've told you what the problem is. You should do this in some way, shape, or form if you haven't thought about it already. Do a reimbursement assessment. It's a snapshot of what your reimbursement work looks like for your product right now, and that's coverage, coding, and payment. I've already gone through it. I won't go through it anymore. You do a fair bit of these. It can be formal. They can be less formal. But you have to know what that landscape looks like today for all those three elements. And then you got to understand your evidentiary needs. I'm going to let Courtney talk more about that. I don't know, because she talked about some of that already. And then you got to develop a strategy based on that information that you gather. This is what medical tech companies need to do. And that's why I asked Frank to get up. That's what he did. He understood. He said, I understand the process for moving ahead. Okay, so here's why is this such an issue? Because of the way the Accountable Care Act passed because of three factors. Quality of care is not as high as it should be. Access to care is bad. And top priority, you got to bend the cost curve. Cost is, up through the roof. One little note on that, by year 2023, the healthcare expenditure of the GDP will be what percent? Does anybody have a sense of it if we don't control costs? 20%. That's a lot just for healthcare. Why do you think these stakeholders that Courtney talked about are saying, prove it, show me, don't just give me your anecdotal information you think you got, it reduces adverse events, reduces complications, reduces readmissions. You better have evidence that Courtney's going to talk about explaining why that's true. So that's where you want to be. What do I mean by health economic and clinical? They're values. They're two different distinct components. That's what they are. You have to show your technology is better than what's already out there. For clinical and health economics, you got to show the cost is equal to or less than what's already out there. Almost done, Jim. A big factor, FDA versus CMS. The statutory authority for both are different. The statutory authority for the FDA is it has to be safe and it has to be effective. The FDA doesn't really care if it's medically necessary. They're not asking you those questions. That's why Courtney was telling you, if you want the stakeholders down the road after you get through the FDA to give you permission to, they're going to pay for it, then you better demonstrate medical necessity. And the standard for CMS is, it's the Social Security Act. The standard is medical necessity, and then what CMS, Center for Medicare Services, i.e. Medicare does is they interpret that. And I promise you, it's quite a complicated situation to see how they interpret this sometimes. But that's what you need to show. Here's the final slide, really. And this is all leading up to what you have to think about. And that's why I, again, asked Frank to get up. He did a lot of this. This is just one example of what a implementation plan and strategy should look like and the timeline for doing it. So I'm going to just let you look at that. I'm not going to go through all that. And it's in the deck, too, because I know I'm taking up a lot of time. So that's pretty much it. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thank you, Tom. So, Tom, as you are sitting down, you mentioned one example of how things have changed over the last 10 years. I think we're good with that. Is that you start the reimbursement earlier today. Well, how early is early enough? If you can answer that, and then Courtney, if you could answer in terms of how do you design reimbursement considerations into a clinical trial, and how is that trial different from an FDA, just strictly an FDA trial? So how early is early enough, Tom?
Yeah, I hate to say this, but is this on? It depends. It really does depend on the technology. The earlier you start thinking about it, if you have investors asking you about it, I like to say, as I showed my slide, as early in the design phase as possible. I've had some examples. I'll give you an example. It's not Neurotech, but it's orthopedic. A company was able to come to us early, and we went and looked at the descriptors of those codes and said, if you just tweak this device a little bit, you'll fit into this descriptor, and you won't have to get a new code. So that's my answer. If it's not a very good one, I don't know. But you have to think about the design in relation for not all technologies, because I know some of you folks have very sophisticated design and development and considerations. But for some technology, it helps to get an understanding of what the DRGs or CPTs are, and maybe you can add something to that too. So I've talked way too much already.
I think you're right on, and I think I would add to that, if you're comfortable and if it's sufficient payment to slot into an existing set of codes, then you don't have to think too hard about it. But if you need an add-on payment, or if you need to create a code at the outset, that's when you really need to be calling these guys from day one. And now you can see why I clarified that I'm a clinical person and not a reimbursement person, because it really does take a lawyer to figure all that stuff out.
I hope not. I mean, because people are lawyers.
So to your second question about how do you design the clinical trial, I mean, obviously that's the kind of thing that gets my brain excited anyway, which is a strange quirk of my own brain. I really do think it's very different. So what the FDA wants and what the CMS wants are very different things. And it goes to what you just put up there about what the statutory requirements are. So for the FDA, you are required to show that the device is safe and effective. But for CMS, you're supposed to show that it is medically necessary. For the payers, they can kind of make things up, frankly. And the thing that's important is that these are companies that are for-profit companies that have to produce quarterly earnings reports just like the big medical device companies. So every quarter, they're supposed to be showing that they're making more money than they're spending. It used to be, back when I started, that we talked about a 3-year time horizon of patients, that a patient would stay with a company for 3 years, so as long as the payer saw the benefit of a given therapy over 3 years, it would be all right. But recently I talked to some medical directors of these companies, and they said their horizon is 3 months now, because they're on the same quarterly earnings schedule as all the other people. So that really puts a lot of pressure on us as device developers, because these devices are so very expensive. So if we're trying to get a device that's $20,000 paid for, and they're used to paying out, $100 a pill over a much longer time horizon, that's going to be a pretty hard sell for them. So that's the kind of thing you need to think about. So if the codes are already there, the payments are already there, you can slot into those. They don't really care which device you're going to pay for. But if you have to develop a new code, then that's a whole other situation. And of course, it's all different in Europe.
So speaking of new codes, we have a number of very novel approaches here. And we have the opportunity with Tony Arnold, who founded and CEO and president of SetPoint. I'm sure most of you know SetPoint. But they're doing vagal nerve stimulation for anti-inflammatory conditions. This is pioneering work, and they've had tremendous success from an investment perspective and clinical perspective up until this point. So in terms of reimbursement, can you perhaps just summarize a little bit about some of the challenges or successes you've had when you started the process? Maybe just spend 2-3 minutes, and any comments you want to make around reimbursement as it relates to a novel device.
I'll do it. I can speak pretty loudly, so I think you can all hear me. Like Courtney said and Tom said, we started early. We did multiple reimbursement assessments, but having worked at Boston Scientific and Medtronic and Advanced Bionics, one of the things that our finance people didn't like was the same thing that the payers didn't like, and that was you get a big upfront bolus of cash for the devices we all deal with, but we work with the patients for the next 5, 8, 10 years to improve outcomes in epilepsy or improve outcomes in inflammatory diseases, but we don't recognize value for that. So one of the things we wanted to do at SetPoint, and I've urged the company to do as it goes forward, is figure out a way to break that into smaller bites that are more like a pharmacologic model. But the problem with that is there are no existing codes for that. It doesn't fit within the paradigm unless you go to the prescription side of the benefits, and you don't capture it up front. So I've always had a vision that there's a way for those of us that do neuromodulation and bioelectronic development to partner together and go to the payers to say there's a better way to pay for them. It's risk shared. We don't get paid, the patients don't get better, and if we don't deliver economic value, I would do that with SetPoint. I'm that confident in it, but you get paid over time. And it's advantageous for a company like SetPoint and potentially for a payer, because we're competing against drugs that retail for $45,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year and have pretty horrible side effects. So we have a really strong health economic argument. So the real challenge for a company like SetPoint is we'll have investors that say, hey, there's great VNS codes that yield about $30,000. You need to go get those right up front. And comparing that to a biologic drug that are $60,000 a year, like Courtney said, we've heard payers telling us, used to be a 3-year horizon. When I started, that was always my assumption. And in just the last year, I've heard it's 3 months to a year. Now our economic advantage in that short horizon doesn't look as good. So it making me want to double down, believe there's a reason to double down on, hey, in the long run you may pay more, but we'll go at risk with you for performance-based therapy, which also helps us fund longitudinal improvements in therapy. We can do things with these devices pharma companies can't. We can keep gathering data, improving outcomes. So we didn't have the solution, Jeremy. We never came to it. The company's still working on it. And the biggest challenge, again, is you don't fit in either existing paradigm. So most of the consultants tell you, just don't do it. It's a 5 or 6 year process. Just go to the CPT code for VNS, take your money, and and rhyme. So I'll leave that to the panel to say, how do you make that happen? But I think it's a better way for the payer and the
That's
company.
interesting.
Well, just to Tony's point, because I know the theme of the discussion was new models, and you kind of reminded me of alternative payment models with Medicare and bundled payments, and there's a lot going on nowadays with Medicare and especially private payers who usually are in front of Medicare on a lot of this, and you probably know what I'm talking about, Courtney, where accountable, you've heard these catchphrases, alternative payment models. Accountable care organizations are part of that, where they're integrating the payer function and the provider function and some of the medtech capabilities. Another example, like congestive heart failure and orthopedic care were two that Medicare targeted a couple of years ago and saying, we're going to give you this target price. If you can stay below that target price for an episode of care, including the device itself, the provider and others get money back. If you go over it, you have to pay Medicare back. And so that's the private payer market that's growing. This is the alternative payer world, and you're kind of talking about it, Tony. That's happening nowadays because this paradigm that I just showed you up there, that's traditional fee for service. That was developed by employers in World War II to attract workers. And then they built this structure over it, and Medicare came along in '63, and it's fee for service. You do it, I'll pay for it. That cannot be sustained because the top priority has to be to bend the cost curve. So I'm on my soapbox, but I'm really asking you folks in the audience to think about alternative payment models, ways of getting evidence development if you want your technology paid.
Thank you. I'd love to hear from, is that Doug back there? Doug, so from a VC perspective, when you look at reimbursement as a consideration in terms of to invest or not to invest, or can you just say a few comments about your appetite to invest in a company, for instance, that is novel and doesn't have reimbursement coding already in place, for instance?
I feel like this is probably the wrong answer for the panel, but because we invest at the earliest stages, what we're really screening for in the beginning is the entrepreneur and the team. And so at the seed stage, we're not really thinking that much about reimbursement because there's a high probability that whatever the team thinks they're going to build is going to be slightly different or maybe drastically different than what they eventually build. So what we're trying to screen is this entrepreneur, is this founding team, can they move the earth and bring a product to market? And then when we get to the A and the B round of financing, which is usually a stage or two after us, that's when I think it's more appropriate from a venture perspective to think about the reimbursement.
Great, thank you. I'd like to shift gears just a little bit. I'd like to get a show of hands. Who's familiar with the parallel review process with FDA and CMS? Is everyone familiar with that? Who's not familiar with it? Okay, so quite a few. So, Courtney, would you like to explain, or Tom? Okay, Tom. First of all, it's a really interesting program that has had very little success, and we want to understand a little bit why that is. So this actually started in 2011. I'll just give a quick backgrounder, where to address the problem that, well, how do we create efficiencies in going through the process so that, well, both FDA and CMS, you can do a parallel review process and get both approval and coverage in one fell swoop. Well, that started in 2011. It became a formal program in 2016, and to date, all of 3 companies have pursued it. So perhaps can you provide a little more insight to what it is, perhaps, and why haven't more companies taken advantage, and what are they worried about?
Well, I can tell you a little bit more about what it is, but why companies haven't taken advantage, I'm not so sure, to be honest. But it's a parallel review is like Jeremy said, it's a program established by FDA in conjunction with CMS, but it also involves private payers now. Some private payers have signed on to the program, so FYI, everybody. And it's really because you've heard people talk this morning about FDA wanting to speed things along. And I think even Medicare and other private payers, if there's good technology and you think you have good economic endpoints, and this is what you can talk about, Courtney, because you're the one who would be able to speak as to what data CMS and private payers want in those initial FDA trials. But the idea is when you go into a pre-sub meeting, it's only for de novo or PMA, not 510K. You sit down with both parties and you talk about this. And then you get information, and maybe I'll turn it over to you as to what information they would be looking for in that setting. I don't know if...
Sure. So I think this goes back even to something we were talking about earlier that Jim was trying to pin down, the placebo effect and how device companies work with the placebo effect and how all that works. One of the things that's really interesting about that is, as I alluded to, so the FDA is looking for is the device safe and effective? And the CMS is worrying about, is it medically necessary? So those are two different standards. So what the FDA wants you to show is, I am better than a placebo. I can actually show you that my device is effective and that it's safe over a certain period of time. So it's almost like a snapshot in time at 3 months, at 6 months. I've really done a good job of showing that these group of patients are better than that group of patients, and that it was safe, that my risk-benefit ratios are good. What CMS is really looking for instead is, should I pay for this thing? Is it worth my money, sort of based on, can I justify paying out money for a technology? Is it safe? Is it effective? Is it going to save the payers money in the long term? Is it going to bend this cost curve? That's a lot in Europe. Say in the UK, that's a lot easier to understand because they actually quantify how much better a person has to get in order to, versus how much it costs. So there's actually thresholds for, if you can improve quality of life X, then I will pay Y for it. In the US, it's much more squishy. They're not looking for that. But the consequence is they want to know how it's going to perform over the long term. In the real world, they don't really care so much, is it better than placebo? They're perfectly willing to consider placebo as part of the effectiveness package, but they do want to know how it does over the long term and in the real world. So they don't want, this small group of patients that are cherry-picked with the world's best doctors and all of that sort of thing. They want, your Acme physician in your Acme hospital with your regular old patient. How is that guy going to do? And so this is a very different model, really.
I just add one thing to that about parallel review is that's only one approach to getting input from payers as soon as possible. And like you said, there are only 3 companies that have gone through it. I think FDA is really making a push to get more and more companies up front and involved early with CMS or private payers who have signed up for this program. Kaiser, I think, is one of them. United Healthcare just joined. But you can also just go meet with CMS independently and just sit down and talk to them. Here's what we're thinking. We met with FDA over here. What do you guys think about what design study protocol you would like to do with private payers? You can meet independently with private payer medical director groups. One thing that we do is surveys of payers so they won't know what the technology is. And you can get some feedback from payers, private payers, as to, why aren't you covering this technology? What would it take for you to cover this type of technology in the future? So you can get some helpful feedback to help you design your studies too. Right. Anyway, it's just not parallel review is what I'm saying.
Excellent point. In the remaining 5 minutes, I have a lot more questions, but I want to shift the focus and see who wants to ask a question to either of them or to any of the CEOs here regarding reimbursement. So let's take some questions. Dan.
Thanks for the comments on parallel path review. I'm looking at that as an option, and what I'm hearing is that people are scared of that. If only 3 companies have gone through in the past, 6 or 7 years, that people are wary, and I still don't know why, but it's curious. I have another, which is perhaps you could talk a little bit about coverage. So the first of the 3 legs of the stool. There's already a CPT code for implantable neurostimulators that we think we would fall under, right? And it's reimbursed about $27K, which is great. But there is no coverage for traumatic brain injury for implanting neurostimulators. So this is where those early conversations with payers come in. What would be involved in getting a national coverage determination? And what I'm hearing is you not only have to have that conversation with CMS, but some of these private payers as well. And in particular for patients with TBI, I think the VA is a potential partner there as well.
There you go. Yeah. Just on your point about Dan, is it?
Yes.
Dan mentioned CMS national coverage decisions. CMS has multiple coverage pathways. The national decision is, I remember years ago when people talked to companies like Medtronic and talked to them, why didn't you go after a national coverage decision? Because they said, we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. So they went after local Medicare subcontractors in certain regions of the US and asked them, gave them their evidence, got feedback from them. And if they said, well, here's what you need, then they don't have something in writing from the national coverage determination process saying no or qualifying it. So there's nuances here that I want to reinforce as to it's not absolute as to how you do these things. But I don't know if I answered your question or not.
Well, that's why all the companies I've been with or seen where, you don't take reimbursement on yourself, right? It's so critical to the success of your business. Often companies will hire multiple reimbursement experts just to see if they have different opinions, and if they're in alignment, great. But it's just such a critical piece of your business. So, more questions? Yes, please.
I was just wanting to. Sorry, it's okay. I can talk louder. I was just trying to make a comment on the parallel review. I think first, parallel review only applies to 10% of the devices because it only applies to class 3. So a lot of devices, if you're class 2, you won't actually apply. So the statistics is not really fair that way because it only applies to class 3. And also, people don't want to apply for it because the CMS review actually gives you the NCD, the national one, which is typically a lot stricter than the local one. But in order to get to the Medicare reimbursement, you don't need the national, you can do the local. So that means if you really want the CMS parallel review, you're automatically shooting for the national, which is harder. And how much harder? There are research studies saying that to get to the parallel review, the part you are going to get the CMS is actually harder than the FDA. So you're spending more effort actually getting the NCD code than getting PMA. So, and you're kind of tie yourself into it because once you're doing the parallel review, you're doing it together. So some people don't really want to do it. They want to, why don't I just get PMA, I get the local review. So there's some, that is kind of the background for that.
Maybe you two should connect a little bit.
Okay. Because I worked on the payer side.
Oh, so
all my life.
that would be interesting. I'm going to give the last question. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but the last question to Jim, if you have a question.
I don't have a question, but we can take one more before we conclude this session, and then I have some closing comments.
All right. Yes.
I was at AdvaMed this year, and I was at a panel where somebody from, I think, Blue Cross of Virginia, he was the grand poobah for innovation and paying strategy, and he was talking this great game about how they were looking down the road at value and devices and all this stuff. And somebody asked him, like, how far down the road are we talking about here to demonstrate value? And he said, oh, we're looking way down the road these days. Wait, like 9 months or a year. I don't understand. Is that, somebody asked him why, and he said, well, because 40% of our customers are on a different plan next year.
Right.
Yeah. And I don't understand how we're going to solve that problem in the device space. Because that time frame is, I would guess, universally short for medical devices, especially implantable ones. What is our plan for overcoming that hurdle? Because that seems like a showstopper for a huge number of good ideas.
Who wants to answer that one?
Well, go ahead.
Well, so I think a few ideas have been brought up already that I want to reiterate, and I'll let Tom talk to it as well. But, one is this idea of bundled payments. If, my dad had a back surgery this past summer, and usually it used to be you'd go get a back surgery, and then you never heard from that doctor again. Well, in this case, the nurses were calling him every week. He had twice a week. They were checking on his meds. They were checking on his behaviors. They were making sure he was walking. Everything was was being tracked really carefully. And my dad was like, this is great. What a great doctor I've got. I'm like, no, Dad, this is all about bundling. This is about those docs get paid more if you don't have an infection, if you reduce your medications, if you don't have to come back in, they get paid more money. So that's to our benefit, I think, because if we can take advantage of the bundling so that you pay for spinal cord stimulator, but then that's how they get treated well, then we can get paid. I think the other piece is this idea of pay for service. For a spinal cord stimulator, I can imagine that could be a tricky business. But there was a model for percutaneous tibial nerve stimulation or tibial nerve stimulation where you're already going into the doctor, once a month or a few times a week or whatever. And so then you actually could do this fee-for-service model, which I think would be really interesting. But I think it's going to take, as Tony said, a shift in the way we all think about it, not just the payers, but also the device manufacturers. So it's something we're going to have to work on.
I know everybody's really hungry and wants to go have a drink. This is, you raised a good point. I just want to add to what Courtney said is Blue Cross does that because, like you said, a lot of their people are on their plans for a few years, but those beneficiaries go somewhere else to another private payer somewhere. So I go back to the theme that we've all been talking about, value. You have to show value through evidence development. So everybody here has to think about evidence development. I don't care if it's for hospital adoption, for the Blue Cross adoption, for Medicare adoption. You better have well-designed clinical and health economic data to show these payers. And then you can start wedging yourself in because these big payers especially only have to knock off about 5 or 6 national payers, private payers only. And we all pretty much know who they are, and some of the regional blues, and then you have a lot of coverage already.
Great.
All righty.
Thank you, Tom.
Jeremy, thank you very much. Panelists, thank you very much. That was an excellent session.